Hello, and welcome to this episode of Block Party. My name is Nicholas Carey, co-founder and vice chairman of blockchain.com. Today, we have a very special guest. I'm excited to introduce Kwasi Kwarteng. He's the former Chancellor of the Exchequer of the United Kingdom, a published author, and an entrepreneur. Welcome to the show, Kwasi. You've been a career politician, you've been an entrepreneur,
Sure.
you've also worked at the highest levels of government and politics and money. And I want to just have your perspective a little bit. Like, how have the perspectives of being a politician, but also an economist and a historian, sort of shaped your views on money in the first place?
So the one thing that I learned in government, and I was chancellor briefly. We try to do various things, is that the institutional barriers to actually affect change are very difficult in politics.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example of this. When I first went to the Treasury in September 2022, the British state was spending about £1 trillion in the budget. And I thought, well, surely we'll be able to take 5% off that. And most people, listening to this, they wouldn't like taking 5% off their costs as a household or even as a small business. But they could do it.
Yep.
If they focus, they could find a way. But as a public finance treasury minister in politics, very difficult. Even 5%. So 5% would have been 15 billion.
Yeah.
But there's so many vested interests. So you've got to have a really, really strong will to be able to do that. And the problem, as I'm sure we'll discuss, is that many Western governments just simply can't bring themselves to cut so much as 5%
Right.
off the budget. And the problem with that is that if you're spending more and more and more and unwilling to reduce expenditure, you're going to resort to the printing press ultimately.
Money, has been said what makes the world go around. It's the thing that drives so much anxiety and stress at the kitchen table, drives stress at a national level. But money is, in a lot of ways, sort of a technology. Human beings have been using different forms of money since the prehistoric age. It predates written word. It's why we find interesting artifacts and burial sites and tombs all over the world. And we've tried these different sort of, I would say, technologies, whether it's beads or feathers or tablets or gold or paper monies. So talk to us a little bit about the evolution of money and maybe even from the context of War and Gold, your fabulous book, which really sort of looks more at the last 500 years.
Yeah, it does.
But that's sort of recent memory for money.
That is. So just starting off, forgive me, with War and Gold, if you're going to write a history of money, you've got to start somewhere. And my view was that in terms of the modern world, the biggest thing, and I think John Maynard Keynes, who I don't agree with about much, but he said really the influx of gold and silver from the New World, particularly into Spain in the 16th century,
sort of triggered a capitalism.
triggered a new phase in capitalist history. But actually, you're quite right. I mean, if you look back, my background originally academically was in classics and ancient history, and if you look back, gold has been around for 2,500 years. I mean, you read Xenophon or Aristotle, any of the ancient authors, Plato even, they talk about gold.
Yep.
And gold, Croesus, Richest Croesus, he had lots of gold. And gold, I think, has been at the center of monetary history for 2,500 years. And that's, in a way, why my book is called War and Gold. And I think the extent to which gold has always been thought of as money is really underappreciated. I mean, you look at the Bible, the money there is gold and silver.
Yep.
You look at ancient literature, they talk about gold, and to a lesser degree silver. And even as late as really the 19th century in England, in Britain, they talked about the gold standard, gold notes in the US really until the 1930s. Gold and silver, but particularly gold, was a monetary, was the main monetary currency.
Very recent history. So why gold, though? And for those that aren't familiar with the properties of gold, why not molybdenum or aluminum or something else?
So gold had this unique, it looks nice, it's shiny, and it had this particular sort of transferability. People could carry it. It's heavy, but you can carry it. It's got these unique properties in terms of its physical beauty, its luster. It doesn't decay very quickly. And it had this incredible cultural association. And that's one of the points of the book. I mean, even the Aztecs
Yeah.
So anyone from the Aztecs in South America earlier, Alexander the Great in China, all across the world over the last 5,000
Yeah,
years.
civilizations that were not talking to each other.
They weren't talking to each other. They
Yeah.
were completely in isolation of one another. But somehow gold had this unique appeal to human beings for lots of reasons. They covered themselves in gold. Even the Aztecs, who didn't use it as a means of exchange, they had beautiful goldsmiths who constructed jewelry, who constructed artifacts of great value, physical, aesthetic value. And that was one of the things when the Spanish went to the New World, they were amazed.
That's what they were looking for,
at
right?
the artifacts, exactly.
Yep.
Even though technically gold was not a means of exchange. So gold has exerted this incredible fascination for human beings for thousands of years. And there's a great phrase in Virgil, and in Latin it's auri sacra fames. It's the sacred hunger of gold, auri, aurum.
Right. Our desires. Yeah,
Desire for gold. I mean, he specifically says gold. And in fact, as late as the 1930s, I think there's a great essay that John Maynard Keynes wrote before he went kind of full Keynesian, as it were, about this sacred hunger for gold. And he tried to debunk gold. He tried to use Freudian theory to say this is something to do with some sort of weird complex and retention of
someone's relationship with your mother. Oh, God.
All of this sort of
oh no
nonsense. But it's a theme in monetary history that's probably the most consistent theme there is. And we're always trying. I think once the gold standard was ended in 1971 by Nixon, there's always been a feeling that somehow we should try and get back to gold. And as we speak, gold is reaching heights that we've never seen before.
Literally today, gold and silver, all-time
today.
highs.
All-time, $5,000 an ounce. And if you think in Bretton Woods it was $35 an ounce,
I know.
You can see how
really understand the debasement of currency through that lens specifically.
That's absolutely
what
right.
happened in 1971? Like, why did
it's
that happen?
It's a fascinating story. So what happened, I think, was obviously post-44. And this is the theme of my book. Every time there's a war, governments essentially stop the gold standard and resort to the printing press. Very
or they
crudely.
steal people's gold, they
or they confiscate
it.
or do they. But actually, after the Napoleonic Wars, after the First World War, and after the Second World War, each time the victor powers, the winning powers, went back to the gold standard. So in each of those three wars, Britain was on the winning side. And they went back in 1821 to a gold pound. For 25 years, it had been a paper pound. You couldn't convert the pound into gold for most of the Napoleonic Wars. In World War I, they suspended the gold standard, but of course we went back to the gold standard in 25. And in World War II, exactly the same thing happened. Bretton Woods, essentially. And it wasn't the other currencies, only the dollar could be exchanged for gold, but all the other currencies were essentially pegged to the dollar and therefore had a gold value. So, all that time, those three big wars over 150 years duration, interspersed with periods of peace. At the end of them, we went back to gold. Now, what happened in the 60s? Two things. In America, the Americans decided to fund the Vietnamese War through, fiscal expansion. And just as the Vietnamese War was hotting up in the mid-60s, Lyndon Baines Johnson essentially had the Great Society program. So his view, there's the old adage about guns, you can either have guns or butter. And the Johnson view is you can have both.
Right. Why not both?
Why not? Exactly.
Us.
Why don't we just... And so that was in 1965, his Great Society bill, roughly. Vietnam is picking up. And there's no accident, within 6 years, under the pressure of all this spending and not being able to cover the spending through tax, that was too much of a pressure on the gold standard. You couldn't, and the problem was that countries like France, anecdotally Germany, they'd go metaphorically to Fort Knox and say, here are our notes, we want to get gold. And essentially there was a run on the dollar and people were converting to gold. And Nixon essentially shut that window in 1971. So he ended 2,500 years of monetary history. And I think a lot of that was, and you'll have different interpretations as there always are in history, but essentially that was driven by the Democrats, Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society and the Vietnamese, the
It's kind
Vietnam
of
War.
incredible how that pill was swallowed. The U.S. sort of like said, we're not going to give you gold anymore, but you have to take these dollars. And it just sort of went through.
So, and you could rapidly, you know, if you look, I think it was August 71. It was 15th of August 1971, as I remember, was when he announced that they were going to suspend the gold, being able to exchange dollars for gold. And as I recount in my book, it was during the older listeners will remember Bonanza, that cowboy show, and he essentially it was halfway through Bonanza on a Sunday afternoon that he made this presidential announcement, and had a huge historic impact. But at the time, people didn't think it would be permanent. The assumption, if you look at his statement, he wasn't saying, "Well, I'm going to end the gold connection forevermore." It was very much framed in the language of a suspension.
Interesting.
And so, you know, he didn't say, look, I'm going to end 2,500 years of monetary history by essentially having fiat currency. But you look at the monetary history in the 70s, gold went from $35, $38 an ounce in 1971, which was the nominal exchange rate. And by 1980, it was $800. So there was a huge, that first decade of a pure fiat system, gold went up more than 20 times. And that was an extraordinary spike in the price of gold. So if you compare the $5,000 today, an ounce, to $800 in 1980, inflation adjusted, it's not as big as the spike was.
The original one,
The original one was in between 1970 and 19.
I'd have to pull up the data. I'd love to look at like the 2008 to today, because obviously we have a catastrophic fiscal crisis.
That's a very good point.
And we see sort of a new problem.
but the spike in the price of gold happened pretty much immediately from the suspension, you know, of 1971.
So why is like political survival always trump like economic orthodoxy?
Because that's immediate. I mean, the thing is about, and you look at those wars, and I talk about the Napoleonic War, you talk about the First World War. They always thought, well, our job now is to win this war, and to print enough money at any cost. We can worry about the problems
at any cost.
We can worry about the
where
problems.
That expression might come
we can
from.
worry about the problems later.
Yeah.
And in the book, it's not just, you know, Napoleon and all the rest of it. I mean, you look at people like Philip II, the Spanish. One of the reasons they caused great inflation was because they had to pay for troops.
Yep.
You know, the big cause, the way in which you circulated money was, you know, you're the king of Spain, or, you know, the emperor, whatever, what have you, and you have to pay for Spanish soldiers in the Netherlands. You've got to pay for them across Europe in campaigns. And the way you pay for them is in gold pieces. So that's what's driving the inflation. And again, the one lesson my book talks about, and I see it now, is, you know, fiscal incontinence leads to monetary debasement.
Yeah.
Always. If you can't control your spending, you will debase the money. And that goes back to
an old historical trend.
It's a pretty obvious tautology. But that goes back to Roman times.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the first sort of debasements in the 3rd century AD, you know, the emperors had to pay for soldiers, and the way they paid for soldiers to defend the frontier was to debase the currency.
Yeah. In your experience in politics, you said like the institutions are just very rigid or difficult to adapt. How, like, if you were to rate their financial fluency from a scale of 10 being very fluent to 0 being absolutely no idea where wealth and money is derived from, I mean,
it's between 1 and 3.
Yeah, very low.
I mean, obviously they don't have zero knowledge.
Yeah.
They've got some sense of it. But in fact, you know, a lot of politicians, and I've stepped out of politics, so I can see it, I've got some distance, they don't really care. You know,
wow. So they don't know and they don't care. That's a potent combination.
Because a lot of the it's like John Maynard Keynes, you know, one of his more flippant remarks, in the long run, we're all dead.
Right.
So, you know, they're totally focused on the short term, and they're totally focused on getting re-elected.
Right.
So if you say, well, look, this is going to cause a hideous inflation and monetary debasement.
Not my problem.
I mean, they wouldn't say
right.
that was how they thought, but mentally that's deeply embedded in their brain.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things now is we're operating in a world with more sort of knowledge, hopefully a bit of better understanding of our own histories, maybe not always with the ability to comprehend them. But these are sort of causing people to think quite seriously about, well, why are things the way they are? We trust dollars, and I'm not even sure I understand. As a young person, are like, where does money come from? And they don't know about the Federal Reserve or fractional reserve banking or credit creation in the economy. And they wonder, well, why does it feel like the opportunities in my future just feel so more limited and like it's getting more expensive to do everything and everyone's in debt? So these sort of questions, I think, enter, every generation's experience, but they seem to be, in some ways, maybe more accelerant today. So for you, when did you first learn about digital currencies and cryptocurrency? Because, as a student of economics and history, and I would love to, what was the aha moment?
So my academic background was in classics, the study of the ancient world, and British imperial history. That's where my family are from. West Africa, so we were part of that imperial world, if you like, colonial world. So classics, the ancient world, and kind of modern Britain through the empire were very much things that I was aware of. And if you study those subjects, you're very conscious of, obviously, empire, of government, how the hell do you pay for empires, military campaigns, all of those things are centrally important. And that's where the dynamic between war and gold, the title of my book, comes in. Because empires fight wars, and they have to fund those wars.
Yep.
And how do they fund them? And for most of Western, global history, they funded them through precious metals to pay soldiers in a universal currency. Now, when I wrote my book in 2013-14, it was published in 2014, so I did most of the research in 2012, 2013. Crypto was just about, particularly Bitcoin, was just emerging.
Yeah.
Crypto was still even in its infancy, but Bitcoin was emerging. I remember thinking to myself, I could write a final chapter on Bitcoin and crypto, in which case I'll have to double the length of time. Because I didn't have the skill set. You have to, and I've had to educate myself in that. Or I could just limit the subject to traditional currencies. So fiat towards the end and gold and silver. So I took the decision, done most of the research. But of course, by 2014, when my book was published, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies had become more well-known, more established. And I was in government at that time. I became a minister, I think, in 2017 or 18. And so I was always interested in it from a policy point of view.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that this was the most interesting thing that had happened in the history of money in the last 2,500 years. And when something, that's 10 years old is the most interesting thing that's happened, you pay attention to it. And it hasn't gone away. I mean, it's something which is people are focused on. There's a whole community of people that are focused on this. And I think rightly, because the fiat currency experiment, if you want to call it that, hasn't worked too well.
Yeah.
I'm 51 this year. I was born in 1975. So fiat currencies are only 4 years older than I am, which in the grand history of the world.
I didn't think of it that way. Right. That's an experiment too. We see what's happening. There seems to be more and more and more of it every year, and our purchasing power, goes away.
And my dad, he was an economist in Ghana, in West Africa.
Oh, cool.
London.
I guess the apple didn't fall too far from the tree.
No, it didn't. But he was born in 1941. So he's somebody who, he wasn't historically minded, but he was interested in development economics, the developing world, post-colonial world. And so, in his, he's only 85. He sadly passed away. But for someone like that, what Nixon did happened when he was 30. So for anyone over the age of 75, their early experience as adults was very much before fiat currencies.
Right.
And we think of fiat currencies as if they've been around forever.
Yeah,
but as I say, it's only since 1971. In America, we're celebrating the 250th year since independence, 1776, 2026. It's a young country.
Yep.
So that's 250 years. And fiat is only 54 years. So it's a very, very recent experiment.
Do you think the public has become more skeptical of monetary authority because of sort of the understanding of how these systems just are operating?
Yeah, I think in Britain we've got a wonderful skepticism about authority. So even though people aren't taught about it in schools, even though I think there's a huge skepticism about digital currencies, Bitcoin in particular, in the political educational establishment, even now in Britain, there are something like 7 million people who have exposure to digital assets.
Yeah.
That's probably about 15, almost maybe 20% of the adult population or the active working population, and they've all educated themselves
Yep.
about it. They've gone on the internet, they've looked at YouTube videos, they've read about things that articles. They haven't been taught about crypto or about digital or about
great
Bitcoin.
point. Yeah.
And so in Britain, people are educating themselves, and I think that's happening worldwide. You go to Africa, you go to particularly West Africa, jurisdictions where currencies aren't stable at all.
Yep.
And there's a huge appetite, particularly for Bitcoin and the whole digital asset space in general.
Yep. We've witnessed the same thing in the data we see at blockchain.com and many of these emerging markets where you have maybe had colossal collapses in confidence in local currencies. People seek stability. And I think Bitcoin has certainly emerged and come out as an incredible use case for that. I'm interested, do you see Bitcoin and crypto, as an adversary to the state and its power systems, or is it just is it a response to this sort of failure of the institutions to responsibly manage currency supplies? How do you think about it?
I think it's a response. So, I was in government for 5 years between roughly 2017 and 2022. And during that period, obviously, we had COVID.
Yep.
And you look at the inflation effects of
it's unbelievable. It's parabolic.
Incredible. It's incredible. So, if I told you that the dollar in 2020, I'm not talking about 50 years ago.
Not 2000, not BC.
2020, I'm not talking about, the ancient world. I'm talking about the year 2020, where we all remember 2020. I mean, you'd have to be very young not to be able to remember that. But the dollar has depreciated 25% in that time. And people feel it. They feel it. I mean, that was, I think, the principal reason why the Democrats lost in 24. This whole cost of living, inflation was a huge deal. And people look at that and think, how can the dollar be 25% worth 25% less today than it was 5 years ago?
Yeah, and on that track, it's like another 4 years, and we're
Who
all
knows
50%
Who knows
poorer.
where it'll go? So,
Right?
so people aren't dumb, and they look at this and think, there's got to be a better way for me to preserve my wealth, to look after my family, to make sure that the money I've earned is protected.
Yep.
And many people are looking to, well, we've talked about gold, but they're also looking to digital currencies, Bitcoin in particular, but other cryptocurrencies.
Let's talk a little bit about, I think there's always this sort of hubris, like we can control it. We can control your speech. We can control, your ideologies. We want to control how you think about wealth or money or taxes. So what lessons from maybe monetary history or do you think policymakers are ignoring when they try and regulate Bitcoin or crypto?
So I think the problem that modern governments face in a way that, in the Victorian era, early 20th century, even in John Maynard Keynes' time in the 1940s, the welfare state is a very difficult thing for people to try and restrict. We've seen it in Britain. Even the Labour government, the left-wing government, they couldn't bring about the welfare reform that they wanted to. Republicans, I'm old enough to remember 10 years ago, before Trump, Republicans talked about reforming Medicare and Medicaid, and they won't touch it now.
Yeah.
So the feeling is very much that the way you pay for this very, very expanded welfare state is essentially by printing money. Quantitative easing, essentially forcing institutions to take lower interest payments, issuing treasuries or gilts, and having the central central bank buy the stuff. That's quantitative easing. And that sort of fudge and an inability or reluctance to try and reduce spending has meant that you're resorting to essentially the printing press. You're borrowing more money, you're printing more money, you're getting QE.
Yeah.
And as I say, many of the voters aren't dumb. They can see what's going on. And they can see that as we had a Prime Minister called Harold Wilson who used to talk about the pound in your pocket. They can see the pound in your pocket or the dollar in your pocket is buying less and less.
Yeah.
And it's a natural thing for people to say, well, hang on a minute. Why keep my money in dollars or pounds or whatever it might be,
Right.
whatever fiat currency it is, if it's buying less and less year on year? Why not look to another commodity or currency or monetary system?
Yeah, an instrument, right?
Yeah,
And I
instrument.
think, like you said, people, and I think policymakers sometimes, they're really condescending to the public. They go, "You couldn't possibly understand these things; it's too complicated." And finance has all these terms. It may
That's
make
right.
it seem overly complicated, but
That's right.
everyone feels the pain.
They can
and
see it.
They can see it.
They can
and
totally
the school
see it.
fees go up every year.
They
Cost
can
of living
see
goes
it
up.
in
Energy
college
goes
fees,
up. Everywhere.
all of that.
Yeah, I agree.
Groceries. I mean, that was why we had this extraordinary situation where President Trump was talking about the price of eggs.
Yep.
Like, I don't think he's bought an egg
Probably not in a while.
since he was at grade school, right? but he talked about that in a way that resonated because he knows,
Yeah.
or his people knew that resonated. People can see that, well, if an egg costs X amount of dollars a year ago and it costs nearly double that now, we've got an issue.
So we have this gold standard for thousands of years, and
Long
Bitcoin
time.
has been basically called digital gold, basically mimicking many of the properties that gold
Sure.
possesses. It's scarce, it's difficult to acquire, there's less of it coming into circulation over time, it's transportable, it's counterfeit resistant. So it has all these ingredients to make it really interesting, and it's natively digital for an era of digital commerce I think we're obviously
exactly
all
right.
sort of stepping into. So you've got this sort of global contest now in some ways, which is the West. You've got the Asia competing aggressively, the BRIC nations, the fracture between the UK and Europe in some ways. So people are sort of repositioning, and I think crypto sort of was navigating all of this very interestingly over the last decade, and now is very much on the national agenda, especially of the United States. And I think it's causing this sort of realignment in some ways. Like everyone says, well, now what's our position on this? And many, I think, jurisdictions or countries didn't really want to have a position on it or didn't want to lead and be the first ones out the gates. And you had a few exceptions. I think you saw, kind of progressive regulation out of the Middle East and Dubai, Singapore. So how can the UK in this current era position itself to be the most competitive as it relates to future-proofing the UK's position in the global economy? I think this is something you care deeply about.
Very
you
much.
want to have a growth agenda for the country.
100%.
What's the opportunity here?
So I think that we've rather dropped a ball on this.
Yeah.
Now, to use a American football analogy, we're in the first or second quarter.
Right.
There's time to catch up, as it were. In rugby, which is more my game, I suppose, we're in the first half, so we can recoup ground. As a historian, London is, I'd say, in the last 300 years, the international centre of finance.
I think it's hard to argue against.
It's hard to argue against
Yep.
that. It's been in the top 2 or 3 since about 1600.
Yep.
We had Antwerp and Amsterdam, but London was there, and then latterly New York and a couple of other places. But London has been a constant in that. And given that Bitcoin, crypto, digital assets have been the biggest thing, arguably, in the history of finance in the last 20 years, London should absolutely be at the center of that. And that's why I've decided with a couple of other investors to set up a Bitcoin treasury company based here in London. It's called Stack BTC PLC. I think it's really important that London has a presence. And I think we will catch up. But I think, there are institutional reasons. People are quite slow to adapt. And also we've got very much that British thing where if we didn't invent it, it can't be any good. So there's natural skepticism. But I think we'll get there. I think London, historically, as I say, has been central to global finance. And I think it would be remiss of us not to get involved.
Yeah. What's the message you would want policymakers here at the Bank of England, the FCA, other institutions to hear when it relates to the opportunity, especially around digital assets for the UK, for Britain, to be more competitive globally by embracing this? And I think part of it's in the history of the past, the current opportunity in the future. Right?
So a lot of it's to do with one's ability to innovate and to adapt innovation. I look at myself, I'm 50. Bitcoin is only, 16 years old? So in my mid-30s, everything I'd learned up to my mid-30s had nothing to do really, or not much to do with Bitcoin. I knew about the history of money. I knew a bit about politics. I knew lots of, bits about lots of different things. But, the ability for institutional people, senators, congressmen, members of parliament, bureaucrats, really to learn new things,
Right.
I think can be, it's a problem because you're looking at legislators who are in middle age having to deal with things that are really developing over the last 3 or 4 years.
Right.
And it's no accident that actually a lot of the innovation is driven by younger people. They've got less baggage, they're arguably mentally more open to new ideas. And so in government, you're always playing catch up. Because people who run the government are generally in their 40s and 50s,
Right.
but they're
We haven't
having to
gotten
do
there yet.
Yeah, I've got that. And they have to. They're looking. We see this in social issues like digital, social media.
Yeah.
And regulating kids' access to social media. Lots of areas in society and politics where innovation is happening so fast, and you've got people in positions of responsibility who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s. Who've grown up in totally different times. And there's always that mismatch, particularly in a world where innovation is happening so fast.
Right.
And they need to, the policymakers need to be nimble, they need to be open to new ideas, they need to be talking to people.
Yeah.
And often that isn't the case. And that's why you've got this. So I don't believe in conspiracy. There can be some conspiracies, but a lot of it's to do with inertia and this sort of generational mismatch.
Right. So if you had a dream for the UK, over the next 5-10 years, what would that be, and how would you love to see that play out? Like, to me, I mean, I live here. I've been here for 12 years. I married a British woman. I'm all in, right?
You're all in, yeah.
And my experience was growing up in the United States, but my mother was French. So I've kind of seen a bunch of different systems.
Sure.
My father lived down in South America, where we saw a lot of challenges with currencies.
Sure.
I think the UK, post Brexit, has an opportunity to really differentiate its position vis-a-vis Europe, vis-a-vis the United States and other markets. And so I'd love to hear, if you were able to sort of, imagine what that could be, what it would look like. Talk to us a bit about, a future where the UK is really leading and London is unequivocally the leader
Sure.
and center of digital assets and finance in the future.
So the world that I would like to see, or Britain take a lead in, is very much derived from my past. So I'm someone whose family grew up in the empire, in the colonial system, if you like, and there were lots of bad things that people would associate with it. But actually, you look at what the British Empire at its best, yes, there was exploitation and all of that, but at its best, the rule of law, very, very important, and people respect that in London. I think the other things which are harder are sound money. Britain was the home, the champion, the inventor of the gold standard, pretty much, of the classical gold standard, from the 18th century right up to even Bretton Woods and beyond, and we've talked about that, and balanced budgets. Now, we're so far from that,
Right.
that it's difficult to plot a way back. But I honestly think, sound money in the form of Bitcoin and gold maybe, I think you've got to try and control spending. And I think once you've done that and you can lower taxes in sequentially, can't all happen at the same time, I think you'd be very surprised at how quickly this economy can grow and how wide the opportunities will be for people to take up. Because I genuinely believe that Britain at its core is a kind of mothership of capitalism.
Yeah.
For good or ill, in terms of trade, in terms of the gold standard I've talked about.
I think it's hard to argue that capitalism hasn't helped raise the standard of living, reduce the cost of all
and
goods.
you know
and
what?
things
I
we
mean, I know
consume.
people in
Yeah.
China, and I wrote another book before War and Gold. It's called Ghosts of Empire, and it talked about imperialism and money and all these things. And in China, they study that. I was my people were saying, oh well, you've written Ghosts of Empire. This is what the empire was about. This is what they study. They know our Western history of Britain, of America, even ancient Rome, I imagine. They know that really well.
Yeah.
They understand the ingredients of success. They respect the power that the West had, and they're really interested in how countries like Britain emerged. And if you look at our private schools, I'm talking about private high schools, the extent to which Chinese parents are spending money to educate their kids
Yeah,
in
we still
Britain.
have 4 of the best universities in the world in the UK.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
And they respect the West in a way that the West doesn't respect itself.
Right.
It's extraordinary. And I think monetary systems, political economy, It's very much part of all of that.
It's funny because I spend a lot of time with young students that are trying to navigate, their futures. I live out in Gloucestershire, so I'm around a lot of farmers. They have good years, they've got bad years.
Absolutely. The Cotswolds.
Yes, exactly.
All you Americans are obsessed with the Cotswolds.
I was there way before everyone else got there. But yeah, so when you talk to young people though, and they understand these things, they just go like they're ready to take the pill.
Sure.
I think, which is like we know we may not get the same
Sure.
contract that our parents or grandparents did, but we also don't see how you can continually borrow and spend and debase your currency, and like what's the point in participating in that economic future. And so I think young people are coming around to understanding through the lens of history and a better understanding of sound economics that, hey, we've got to control the spending. Then we can have a different conversation.
That's
maybe
right.
it's lowering taxes. Maybe it's investing that in infrastructure, other things. But like that's really step one. And so I'm optimistic because I think there are.
I'm optimistic.
The youth get it.
They do, but I think also you've got to understand, and I think that the Chinese understand this. You've got to understand the historical process. It's not just good enough to understand the theory of sound money and balanced budgets. You've got to have a real sense of this is how capitalism across the West developed.
Yep.
And you've got to have that historical awareness.
Yep.
And that's where I think a lot of the Chinese policymakers, they really do take history very seriously. They take their own history very seriously. And they take the history of other countries and the global history very seriously in a way that perhaps many of us in the West don't.
So any parting thoughts for our listeners today, and maybe where you would send them if they wanted to learn a little bit more about Bitcoin,
obviously
and especially your
they should all read my book. I mean, that seems. But there are other books that I've and they reference mine. I'm very pleased. So one book, The Big Print,
Yep.
Which many Bitcoiners will know, by Larry Lepard. It's a very good monetary history. Obviously, he's got an agenda, but actually, a lot of the historical insights he makes or he expounds are right, are on the money. I think there are other history books. I was always a big fan of Niall Ferguson.
Yeah. Amazing.
The
He was
money.
we had a chief economist at blockchain.com. He was his thesis advisor. So
he's done a huge amount in this space.
Yeah.
And actually, I used to read him when I was an undergraduate, if you can believe that, in the 90s. And he was one of the few people at that time, and still, who can bridge that gap between history and economics.
Yeah.
Because historians generally hate math. and mathematicians generally have no interest.
They have
or
no
knowledge.
time for historians.
And they don't even understand what that is. But actually, he was one of the first historians that I read who really understood about that world of the economy and statistics and that sort of thing. Very inspiring guy. And there are lots of other. I mean, the book that the best Bitcoin, dare I say, digital asset book I read was Safe Dynamis, the Bitcoin Standard.
Yep, Bitcoin Standard.
Now, I don't agree with all his historical conclusions, but I think that was a very broad, approach to the problem. And I think once you read a few of these books, you can really see the nature of the problem. Because otherwise, you just think that the fiat system was sort of given to us from on high,
Right.
by providence, and has lasted forever and will last forever.
Right.
But actually, when you look at history, you can see exactly how contextual and how recent a lot of monetary history, things we take for granted, are.
I love that. So I think for all our listeners, it's important to spend a little time revisiting our history, understanding the context around which decisions were made, and then also to keep an open mind about how systems can be improved.
Definitely.
And
Definitely.
we're all about trying to upgrade the economy so that it can be better,
right.
cheaper, faster, and more inclusive for everybody.
I think that nimbleness is really important.
Yeah.
Because even to a 40-year-old, 40-year-olds, we're kind of dinosaurs. You're a dinosaur. There are things happening driven by people scarcely out of college, out of high school in some instances, that will change the world. And we've just got to be aware of that.
I always say there's some young person out there dreaming up a better situation, a better
100%.
economic model, and we need to
100%.
empower them a bit too. So thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
spending some time today. I've been eager to talk to you about your book and this podcast for quite a while. So thank you so much for coming
It was
on
a
the
real
podcast.
pleasure.